Hello. Let's talk about something I'm going to call the hostile takeover. This is Hypnotherapist Isaiah McGee. And typically that term is in reference to a business or a conglomerate and the takeover of another business, hostile takeover. But you and I are going to talk about the personal psychological hostile takeover. And this occurs with most people until their awareness of it then releases the dynamic. And that is, whatever our conditioning we grow up with, the brain is familiar with that conditioning. The relationship that you have with your father, the relationship you have with your mom, the relationship you have with your guardian, the relationship you have in your early years when you begin school. And so the brain begins to acclimate and associate itself with the impact of those relationships. And so what occurs is that when you begin to experience your autonomy, typically that happens when you leave the house of your upbringing and you begin to establish your own autonomy when you're living on your own, as it were, is that your subconscious mind still has the conditioning and the perceptions, even some would say the voices of those dynamics and relationships with those that made impressions on us and experiences that made impressions on us as we were growing up. And so this is what happens. And this is what tends to interfere with people wanting to make change based on their authenticity as opposed to experiencing and expressing life from habit and from conditioning and from the history of their upbringing. And that is this. Your subconscious mind, because it's familiar with something, that gives it a sense of identity, that familiarity. And so what your subconscious mind will do once you begin to exercise your autonomy and you're no longer under the roof of parental figures and their impact on you, if you will, because your subconscious mind is familiar with those conditions, then it begins to take on the role of the dominating or domineering mother. It takes on the role of the absent father that gave you the impression you weren't good enough. Your subconscious mind takes on the role, not because it is desiring to experience more suffering, but it takes on the role because of the familiarity with it. And if the dynamic itself, the interference itself, the person is no longer exercising that on a very consistent basis, then your subconscious mind becomes the proxy, if you will, for that person, that dynamic, that issue in your life. And this is what I'm calling the hostile takeover, because your authenticity is always independent of your conditioning and the voices and the oppression to whatever degree of the influences in our life. Your authenticity is always independent of it, and your authenticity is always with you. And so what occurs is that your subconscious mind is defaulting to the familiarity rather than the authenticity of your nature and what it is you truly desire to relate to and what vantage point you desire to express. And the subconscious mind then takes on the role of that particular oppression, if you will, and that is the hostile psychological takeover, if you will. So here's the way that you remedy and release the hostile takeover. For most people, unfortunately, not being aware that their own psyche is taking up the mantle and the baton, if you will, of their oppression, their conditioning, their interferences, if you will, because they're not aware that it is simply taking over that role out of familiarity. It decides to resist it, to fight it, to challenge it, And that requires a lot of effort, and oftentimes the consequences of that effort to resist and to challenge the upbringing and the conditioning that is constricting for you, the consequences can be anger, the consequences can be resentment, the consequences can be the idea of constantly battling something. And so then that becomes the effort that consumes you, rather than you living from that authenticity that is so desired. And so here's what I want to encourage you to do, is that when you awaken in the morning, you begin to have a relationship that is affirmative and supportive with yourself. This is not positive thinking. You literally are replacing the influencer that influenced your conditioning from your youth. You're not denying it. You're not suppressing that influence. You're not trying to change that influence. You are deciding that I will be the influencer. And as you make that decision, then it is then just a matter of you continuing that decision each day, and it begins to reprogram the brain so that that influencer, your own influencer of your authenticity, your own influencer of supporting your self-esteem, your self-confidence, your self-worth, you being the influencer of that. You don't have to feel those things or manufacture those things. You're just deciding that this is what I want to influence my brain. And so I am taking on the role of the influencer rather than defaulting to the familiar influencer, if you will. So you're not fighting, you're replacing. You're not challenging, you're replacing. You're not struggling with, you're replacing. And so each day, when you awaken, you have a conversation, a mental conversation with yourself. And it's a conversation of loving yourself. It's a conversation of being supportive of yourself. It's a conversation of being encouraging of yourself. None of this is from any narcissistic vantage point. This is so that you psychologically, emotionally, subjectively replace the influencer that the brain has familiarized itself with. And your brain will willingly, because of the nature of that organ called the brain, will adapt. And so it will adapt to another influencer, but not from the context that you're fighting something and battling, because then it adapts to fighting and battling. But it can adapt to replacement if that is the context in which you engage. What I am encouraging and suggesting here is that each morning when you awaken, you establish what's the rapport you have with yourself so that you become the influencer of the brain and not your past history and your conditioning. And what you witness occurring is that as you become the influencer of your brain, you then witness your brain normalizing the influencer that you are establishing through the rapport you have when you awaken in the morning and you have a conversation with yourself that is nourishing, empowering, loving, appreciative, joyful with yourself. Begin to have that rapport with yourself, and then your brain begins to acclimate to that as the influencer. And you find that whatever the sabotaging influences were from your upbringing, that they're not denied, forgotten, or suppressed. They have been replaced. This is Hypnotherapist Isaiah McGee. You are deciding to become the influencer that replaces the old influences.